Hello, and welcome to the presentation on textbooks. This is the last chapter of the text and the last primary presentation this semester. There will be some small amount of content in the NETS module to help you review for the NETS exam, so don't forget to check out the NetSuites module. This module covers the last major section. So, why talk about textbooks? Textbooks are important. They are how many of us are introduced to education and critical thinking. We are given textbooks in the first grade, perhaps even earlier, and carry them throughout high school. The method by which these texts are chosen involves a large number of people, school boards, and group decisions. In other words, the way these texts are chosen is much different from the way they are chosen in college. In most colleges, your instructors have a significant amount of academic freedom in choosing your texts. Your instructors in college are also usually highly educated and specialized in the fields they teach, so they are able to bring their own expertise into the classroom along with the information found in the texts. In high school and earlier, however, teachers often themselves rely a great deal on the material found in the texts for their own information in the same way that students do. This makes texts doubly important. Unfortunately, however, decisions made by committee are not often the best. Elected school board officials who choose texts do not necessarily know the first thing about the subjects they are regulating. Choosing textbooks and educating children in general is seen as a battle for the hearts and minds of the young as part of the culture wars, and topics that should be factual become politically charged. History and civics texts are one of the important battlegrounds. How should our leaders be portrayed? Should we show their faults? Should our founding fathers be shown heroically? Should we emphasize mistakes or atrocities our country has committed or gloss over them? Are women and minorities getting fair representation in the text? Are they being overrepresented for a particular time period? Should the book send out a strong patriotic message? Everybody has an opinion on how children should be taught to think about U.S. history, regardless of whether or not one has any particular expertise with U.S. history herself or himself. History books are a primary culture war ground. There's an old phrase that too many cooks spoil the stew. Because high school texts are written by large groups of people and they are written to satisfy committees, they suffer from groupthink. They tend to cover too much in order to satisfy everybody, which means that they do not go into enough detail to capture anything really human about the stories to interest students. Lots of times minor details are emphasized in the same way as important details are. Students are buried under a blizzard of facts that often seem unrelated. The books are often dry and devoid of any real tone or voice. Since these books are essentially written by committee, there is no real thesis or theme to these books. They are books of trivia or facts. A theme or thesis would likely be too controversial for the book to be adopted into a public school. If the book isn't adopted, the publisher makes no money. Remember, these books are not written to please their audience, the students. They are written to please the school boards who choose the text that the students will use. It is okay if they are boring so long as they are not offensive. It is better to drown students with a tsunami of facts if that means that everybody involved in the decision-making regarding the textbook has his or her own particular pet interest in the books mentioned somewhere than to accidentally leave somebody's pet interest out and have the book be rejected. The result is a history text that is a boring, random assemblage of facts for the students. History texts often have a tendency to be dumbed down. They are dumbed down linguistically. This unfortunately often forces authors to oversimplify history. Our text points out that critical thinking questions in history texts often do not test critical thinking at all. The authors give an example of a photo that shows extreme poverty, and then a question that asks students to state what evidence the photo gives of the depth of poverty. But consider how a question that tests real critical thinking might upset members of a school board. What if students were asked to analyze the role that race might have played in a recent election? Or if they were asked to analyze possible human shortcomings of a founding father? Our text also points out that history texts can often go too far with multiculturalism now. This is a result of many cultures having been completely ignored in the past. Women and minorities were completely ignored for the longest time. Now they justifiably receive attention. The text points out that this can be a problem, however, when historians bend over backwards to find examples of minority or women historical figures during time periods where they did not play influential roles. Unfortunately, because of time periods that were sexist and racist, many women and minorities were simply not given the opportunity to shine during these particular times. During these periods, their influence therefore may be muted. Searching for and overemphasizing such figures could therefore be misleading. Oftentimes, there's also a bias in handling of different cultures as well, given perhaps oversensitivity to multiculturalism. For example, the text points out a case where sexism in the Catholic Church was pointed out in detail, but sexism in Islamic countries was downplayed. It is of course understandable that we want to avoid teaching children information in such a way that may encourage racism, ethnocentrism, or other isms. At the same time, however, history is full of nasty truths, and in a democracy we depend on a voting public that is savvy to these truths. In addition, we can easily see how sensitivity to one group can harm another. For example, in the example mentioned previously, sensitivity to emphasizing sexism in Islamic countries may seem to be sensitive in a country where Muslims are often discriminated against, but of course women are also often discriminated against, and does it do women justice when their suffering is downplayed because of political correctness? This is the kind of case we can sympathize with. We can see that people often really have their hearts in the right place when they want to insist on emphasizing material in a particular way. But catering too much to this kind of sensitivity can turn facts away from reality. It isn't simple. History is huge. People have to select which facts to present. As we've seen when talking about the news, simply choosing which facts one presents can not only tell a story, but spin it all by itself. Competing interests often legitimately feel that stories that show their favored group in a negative light therefore involve searching through history and picking negative stories. The text also points out that facts that are embarrassing to the U.S. are often omitted or played down. Remember that in high schools around the country, children are still led in the Pledge of Allegiance. These are very patriotic places. It isn't a surprise then that historical events that are not favorable to the U.S. are played down. The text mentions that the Firestone bombings in World War II, which killed more people than either atomic bomb, are usually not mentioned. Nor is the fact that the U.S. and Britain had an Air Force policy to deliberately bomb German civilians, mostly women and children, in order to demoralize the enemy. We often mention that Germans engage in this behavior, but seldom that we encourage this. Such actions are generally considered war crimes. The U.S. is typically portrayed as a country of heroic motives, a country of peacekeepers. Our financial interests and the interest of multinational corporations are often excluded from the image children are given in school. Unfortunately, the people choosing history texts for states and districts are not composed of historians, nor are the boards that choose science texts for high schools composed of scientists. This means that non-experts are making judgment calls on the most important elements in history or the most important theories in science. Thank goodness when you go to the hospital, your diagnosis isn't left up to a similar majority non-expert vote concerning what non-medical practitioners think is wrong with you and what medicine or surgical procedures they suggest. Happily also, this isn't the way that texts are chosen in college. But in high school and below, bureaucracy is the watchword for text selection. Textbooks and indoctrination. There are numerous and complex reasons for why textbooks are the way they are. But it seems clear that one issue is that various interests want to sculpt the minds of the young to be what they view as ideal citizens. Some people think that ideal citizens should have fiercely patriotic views. They should be shown the best of our country and the worst should be hidden from them. They should be taught that we are the greatest nation on earth in all ways and at all times, morally, economically, militarily, and so forth. Others think that ideal citizens need to be continuously questioning the policies and value of their leaders. They shouldn't be taught that we are the greatest nation on earth no matter what we do. Instead, they should be taught to ask in what ways are we great and in what ways can we be better. In what ways can foreign countries learn from us and in what ways can we learn from foreign countries. People with the second view tend to see people with the first as blindly patriotic. People with the first view tend to see people with the second as overly critical of the U.S., often saying that they blame America first. In terms of high school text, the first view tends to dominate. High school texts are overwhelmingly patriotic, and negative elements are whitewashed or not mentioned at all, with the exception of certain multicultural issues that have become so overwhelming that they are now mentioned in text. The horrors of slavery are now mentioned. The horrible and sometimes almost genocidal treatment of the Native Americans is now mentioned in text, for example. Some say that these are still downplayed, but they are at least present. Which view do you hold? Do you think that being a good citizen and responsible voter means thinking about history in such a way that one is primarily taught patriotism as a value, or questioning authority as a value? How would you go about producing less biased textbooks? Our text mentions that the Swiss-based school program International Baccalaureate Organization is used by many schools throughout the world, and the publishers develop history books from an international point of view, making country-centric view much less likely. What do you think of such a program? Textbooks are highly politicized, and Texas is a key battleground. In November of 2014, the Texas State Board of Education, believe it or not, approved a new history textbook that promotes Moses, yes Moses, for more than 1,500 years before the birth of Christ, as a founding father of the U.S. More than a dozen professors, experts in histories, volunteered to help review history textbooks for the board. All of them were turned down. It was clear that the board was not interested in expertise. They were interested in politics. The role of Thomas Jefferson was also cut. Conservatives do not like Jefferson because he coined the term separation of church and state, and he was replaced by Christian thinkers such as St. Thomas Aquinas. As a philosopher, I have nothing against St. Thomas Aquinas. He produced a lot of great philosophical writings, but his role in history was not the same as Jefferson's. Jefferson was one of the primary minds behind the Bill of Rights, which is a good portion of the U.S. Constitution. He can hardly simply be ghosted out of history without repercussions. Here is a video clip regarding the Texas school books. I'll count down from 5 so you can pause to view it. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Evolution is another issue that is highly politicized in textbooks today. Regardless of whether or not one believes that evolution is true, there is no doubt that the belief that evolution is true is the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community. If the job of science text is to educate students on what the experts in each field of science currently believe is correct, then evolution, without a doubt, is as firmly supported as any scientific view. Cavender and Kahane in our text cite scientific support for evolution at 85% of the scientific community. This number, while it seems high, is actually drastically underestimates the support for evolution. This is because it includes mathematicians, non-researchers, and generally anybody in the American Association for Advancement of Science. Indeed, membership in the AAAS does not require any advanced degree in the field. The poll was taken from general members of this particular organization. Here's what a much better poll designed to test actual researchers in the relevant fields had to say. Out of 480,000 Earth and life scientists in the United States, with respected academic credentials, only 700 believe in creationism. That's less than 0.15%. This means that 99.85% of Earth and life scientists support evolution and deny creation science, even in the U.S., where things tend to be tilted more against evolution than in other major industrialized nations. The National Center for Science Education's Project Steve, for example, has a petition among PhDs in the sciences who have the name Steve specifically. And there are more such scientists with the name Steve alone who have specifically signed this petition than there are those who support creationism altogether. Now again, the issue here isn't whether or not evolution is true. You might argue that scientists have been wrong in the past. You might argue that you think scientists are wrong about this. The issue we are concerned about here is about textbooks, not whether or not evolution is true. The issue is whether or not textbooks are accurately reflecting scientific opinion, or whether they are being politicized on cultural, social, and religious grounds. If one believes that textbooks should reflect what experts in each field believe is the best science of the day, then there is no doubt that evolution is one of the most highly supported and respected scientific theories of all time. It is in fact the central thread of biology, without which most experts would assert biology is just a random association of facts. Censorship. There are many kinds of censorship of textbooks. Sometimes government agencies will come down and try to force content onto public schools. More often, textbook publishers self-censor. They want their textbooks to be accepted, especially by the most influential states such as Texas and California. In history, this means being patriotic and non-controversial, and playing to as many interested parties as possible. In science, this means downplaying evolution and global climate change, and any other theory, regardless of how well supported it may be in the scientific community, if it may ruffle cultural or political feathers. Remember, the experts being consulted for these books are not making the final calls. The publishers and editors are. Textbooks can mean big money when adopted by an influential state, and ultimately publishers are not concerned with education. They are concerned with dollars. Even non-textbooks are censored. Literature, for example, often gets the axe. Sometimes this is done for reasons of being politically correct. Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice has a character named Shylock that portrays Jewish people in a bad light and so often arouses ire. Huckleberry Finn, even though it has a profoundly anti-racist message, uses the N-word throughout the book and so is commonly censored and banned in schools. Other books are censored or banned with less noble intentions. The previous examples at least seem to be designed to spare the feelings of minority students who may be in the middle of classrooms of students who might not be fully able to appreciate the messages of the pieces. It might be difficult, for example, for a black student reading Huckleberry Finn, even if it is an anti-racist book, especially if there are racist students in the classroom who snicker over the use of the N-word. Other works are censored, however, because they have words like hell or damn in them. Perhaps silly when we consider the prevalence of swearing on campus, television, and other media marketed at children of school age, video games and the like. Shakespeare's Twelfth Night often gets the axe because it violates rulings on the portrayal of alternative lifestyles. Other books, such as the Harry Potter series, were systematically banned from school libraries in spite of their tremendous popularity with students of that age group because fundamentalist Christians objected to a magician hero in the books. A movement similar to the movement designed to ban role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s. Many other books seem to be banned because of their stirring political messages, such as Brave New World in 1984. Again, it's worth pausing here to ask yourself what you think about all this. What policies do you think we should shape the adoption of books in schools? Should offensive content alone be enough to ban a book from a school library? What about racist language? How should such decisions be made? School libraries tend to be underutilized by students. As a student in high school, I had a keen interest in science fiction. I burned through many of the sci-fi books in the school library, but most of them were from the 50s and 60s. I happened to run across a few classics that I loved and I might not have found otherwise, but still, it isn't surprising that few students look to the library for entertainment. College texts are not immune from politicking, but as mentioned previously, the situation is much better. College professors have much more academic freedom than do high school teachers. They are typically allowed to choose their own textbooks within reason, although this isn't the case with every college. Another difficulty is the fact that colleges are, of course, in the position of educating students fresh out of high school. College professors are often confronted with students that have been programmed to think of education in a way that is entirely inconsistent with college. That is to say that they have been taught that education is about memorizing facts and regurgitating them on the tests. Many high schools do not emphasize critical thinking. A good deal of the first few years of college is teaching students another method of learning, teaching them to think critically as opposed to memorizing. As mentioned too, many high school tests are dumbed down using very simplified language. Thus, many high school students are unprepared to read college-level tests when they enter college. Further, they have not been taught that they should question what they read and ask challenging questions of the authors. Instead, they have been taught to simply memorize key points and to repeat those points back on test papers. This means that college professors themselves often have to dial back their own textbooks. Many textbooks do not give students primary readings from authors of historical importance because of the difficulty of their prose. Instead, they are given secondary sources that summarize these texts. Many students may think that this is just as good, but this robs the students of the chance to interpret these texts for themselves. There's often disagreement about the nuances regarding what these authors have to say, or regarding what to emphasize. When primary texts are summarized by secondary authors, those secondary authors must simplify the original work. They must choose elements to leave out and make concepts more basic. If they didn't do this, there would be little point in having a secondary text. But of course this comes at a cost. The secondary author is doing much of the thinking for the student. And that ends this presentation. Make sure to go over the chapter in detail and spend some time thinking about these issues. Also, don't forget to check in on the NETS module. There'll not be a major presentation, but I do plan to put a little something up to help remind you of some key issues for the last test.